Om Sthapakaya cha dharmasya sarvadharma swarupine avatara varishtaya Ramakrishnaya te namah. Om Shri Radhikaye vidmahe prema rupaye dhimahi tanno Radha prachodayat tanno Radha prachodayat. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. May this be an offering to Radha Rani. Radhe Radhe. So, today on the eclipse full moon, blood moon, eclipse, blood full moon, we're exploring the wonderfully intoxicating world of Tantrik Vaishnavism because today is the birthday of Gauranga, of Śrī Caitanya. Now, we actually have done, I think, about actually five lectures in all now on the topic. The first lecture we did way back when, about a year ago to the day, I think. Actually, no, I think it was shortly before this day, but a year ago now. It was called Śrī Caitanya's Philosophy of Devotion. So there, we introduced the basic foundational philosophical infrastructure that is the scaffolding for Chaitanya's presentation of bhakti. Now, the question becomes, is this really Chaitanya's philosophy? Because because, okay, because it's possible that Chaitanya had nothing to do with this philosophy. He might have just ecstatically loved Krishna and enjoined others in the ecstatic love of Sri Krishna. And then later, either posthumously or around him, formed a philosophical elite, the Goswamis, which then formulated his unique revelation of divinity into a workable philosophy. So, how much he was involved in this is not quite clear. Some say, of course, he sat with these Goswamis, these founding philosophers, and it not only initiated them, but carefully instructed them in this kind of philosophy, and then they propounded the system known as acintya, bhedābheda. But others say he knew nothing of it. He just came and sang and wept and inspired an entire world and then left. And he was not interested in any kind of philosophical teaching. So maybe the jury is still out on that. Like we don't really know for sure how much Chaitanya was involved in his own philosophy. Similarly, Sri Ramakrishna, what his philosophy actually was is still an open debate. Many of his followers and direct disciples had a different idea as to what he said. The beauty of somebody like Jesus or Buddha or Chaitanya is that they can never be put in a box. Their message is too deep and too profound to be superficially called this or that school of thought. So different schools of thought are possible because of how deep and how rich this message is. So we started with this, the presentation of this philosophy known as the Acintya bhedābheda school, founded by the Goswamis, followers and disciples of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So to celebrate his birthday last year, we started with a presentation of the philosophical system, which I argued creates a nice context for the bhakti, which is the central focus of this tradition. Then, the more important lecture, I think, was the life of Sri Chaitanya. So that was the second lecture in the series. We gave that, I think, the day after Chaitanya's birthday. It was March 25th last year. I remember because it was also Chakreshwara's birthday that day. It was exciting because Chakreshwara spent much of his life from age 16 onwards in like a Gaudiya Vaishnava world. He was in the ISKCON community in a very deep way, and he lived on a farm and tended cows and practiced bhakti all day long with his fellow ISKCON members. So that was very much his world. And it was his birthday last year, March 25th. And I remember it was also the day after Gauranga Purnimā, I think. So anyway, we talked about Sri Chaitanya's life, and that was a much more exciting lecture for me because the philosophy pales in comparison to the life. The life, just studying the life of this master is so enriching. Like whatever tradition we find ourselves in, just studying the life of a great devotee like Saint John of the Cross or Teresa of Avila or some great Sufi master like Rumi or like Hafiz or like Nasiruddin even. Like studying the lives of these great masters of all the world's traditions is spiritually enriching in and of itself because we see the example of what living spirituality looks like. And the life of Sri Chaitanya is very special. The reason why his philosophy is worth taking very seriously is because he is an incredibly intellectually gifted individual. So from his very youth, Sri Chaitanya was not a scholar to be messed with. In fact, he was born, as we said in that lecture, in like a very scholarly and intellectual place. Navadvip at that time was the center of learning for the most refined and sophisticated form of Indian logic called Navya Nyaya. And his father, Chaitanya's father, was a master scholar and practitioner of this tradition called Navya Nyaya. So he was born to a very pious and learned Brahmin family. And from the youngest, earliest age, he already exhibited a profound um, predilection for philosophy and for logic. So he mastered all his logic lessons at a very young age. And I think at age like 16 or something, he became a fully fledged professor. He started teaching Navya Nyaya to his Brahmin elders because he had mastered the philosophy so quickly. So Chaitanya actually started out his life as a debater, interestingly enough. And interestingly, he was an aggressive debater. He would go and find a pundit and debate the pundit and win. He was undefeatable in debate. So he had a very developed and refined intellect, but usually when a person is very intellectually developed, they tend to be, in most cases, quite prideful and quite divorced from their heart and from their fellow community because they're up on a pedestal and they're very much in a world of abstractions. But Sri Chaitanya, importantly, had a very cultivated head, but also a very cultivated heart. So there's that beautiful story I told you last time we talked about Chaitanya last year, where he's on a boat with his friend, and they're both like school-going children at this point, and they're both working on a treatise on Navya Nyaya, on logic, on formal Indian logic. And so his friend is very excited about his treatise because he thinks it's going to be the treatise, like the best text on Navya Nyaya. And so he's talking about it excitedly on the boat. He's like, oh, I'm almost finished with my text, and it's going to be the standard manual for this tradition. Pundits are going to read it, and they're going to come and debate me, and I'm going to win because this text is so great and all of that. And then Chaitanya is like, oh, I also am working on a Navya Nyaya Prakarana Grantha, like a manual for this particular very refined logical system of Indian thought. And then his friend was like, oh. And Chaitanya is like, yeah, let me read you a few lines from my manual. And then he starts to, like, just from memory, quote a few lines from his text. And then his friend starts to cry. And Chaitanya is like, what? Why are you crying? And his friend is like, after hearing just a few lines of your text, I immediately understand that no one will ever read mine. Because yours is obviously the best text ever. And you know what Chaitanya does, Nimai does? He takes his text and throws it in the river. How beautiful. And so Swami Tapasyanandaji, writing about this incident in the Bhakti Schools of Vedanta book, says, the world lost a masterpiece. Oh no, he said, the world lost a spiritual masterpiece. This book, this Navya Nyaya manual that Chaitanya Deva himself was composing would have been a very important spiritual text, right? So Swami Tapasyanandaji said, the world lost a spiritual masterpiece, but it gained a spiritual master. What a beautiful sentence. The world lost a spiritual masterpiece, but it gained a spiritual master. So with that level of love and devotion for his friends, I mean, it's a rare combination of head and heart. There's another scene where Nimai, as he was called in his younger days, would mercilessly point out the hypocrisy, but in a good-natured way, in those around him. So there's a wonderful scene where Keshava composes like 100 shlokas spontaneously in perfect Sanskrit verse about the way the moonlight is playing on the waters of the Ganga. And then Chaitanya listens to it, and he's aware of his friend Keshava's hubris. And so he wants to help him overcome this scholarly pride. So what Chaitanya does is he picks out a line from the middle of this 100 shloka hymn to the moon, and he picks it out and he finds a few grammatical problems with it, thus humbling Keshava. So that's the thing about Chaitanya. He had a really refined intellect, and he was not afraid to use it too. And he used to like to play pranks on the Brahmin elders because he, in a very good-natured way, wanted to point out the religious hypocrisy of the time. But at the same time, he was very, very loving towards his mother and towards his elder brother and towards his community. And so his life is really something to be marveled at. Anyway, his elder brother actually left to become a monk at age 16, Vishwarup or Vishveshwara. And many people say Swami Nityananda, who would later be Chaitanya Prabhuji's right-hand man, was his older brother, who came back and became his friend. But importantly, his older brother became a monk, and then he himself wanted to become a monk, and his 8 sisters died at a young age. So the poor mother, Mother Sachi, Chaitanya's mother, lost 8 daughters and lost her eldest son to monasticism. So you can imagine the relationship between mother and Chaitanya is quite poignant. Sachi and Nimai. In fact, she even named him Nimai after the bitter neem leaf as a sort of apotropaic to dissuade death from claiming him. Hey, death, don't come and take my son. He's a bitter neem leaf. So the name is supposed to protect poor Nimai from the fate of his 8 sisters and whatnot. So it's a very sweet and touching story of a young, precocious child with a prodigious intellect, with a deep and loving heart, who from a very young age was manifesting supreme devotion to God, who used all of his gifts in the service of the divine. And one day he was in Puri. No, sorry, one day he was in Gaya, where you go to do ancestor worship. And there he had an ecstatic vision of Shri Krishna, and even in Puri he had an ecstatic vision, and he found his guru Ishwar Puri, and his guru then Ishwara Puri taught him devotion, and then he forgot all about his nyaya, all about his logic. He was unable to give lectures anymore, so he would stand in front of an audience, actually probably sit in front of an audience, and he would be ready to give a lecture on nyaya, on Indian logic, but instead all he could talk about was Shri Krishna. So it's a remarkable story, the story of his life. Anyway, we talked about it last year. That lecture was called The Life of Shri, or I think it was called Who is Shri Krishna Chaitanya? And that was based on a book that was published in 1581, a long time ago actually, by a person named Krishnadas Kaviraj. And in the last lecture, I was telling you how important that book is, because Sri Ramakrishna would tell everybody to read it. Despite some of the sectarian statements that we find in the book, Sri Ramakrishna really valued the life of Śrī Caitanya, and he wanted his disciples to be proficient in that life because it was so deeply spiritually inspiring, for one, but also because it created the necessary context for understanding Sri Ramakrishna's devotion. So that was the second lecture we did. And the third lecture we did was maybe on the most important aspect, on the bhakti practices. The practices, not the philosophy, not the biography, but the practices. Like, what did Sri Chaitanya actually teach us to do? Now, Sri Chaitanya himself never left very much behind, except for his bhava, and except for like a few verses. So in his few verses of instruction, he tells us to chant the name of the Lord. That's it. That's his only instruction. And importantly, he says, as we chant the name of the Lord, we should be humbler than a blade of grass, patient and forbearing like the tree, taking no honor to ourselves, giving honor to all. Chant ceaselessly the name of the Lord. A beautiful hymn talking about the bhava, the attitude necessary to chant the name successfully. And then he says beautifully in one place, no times are set, no rites are needed. Various are thy names, O Lord, and in each and every name thy power resides. No times are set, no rites are needed for the chanting of thy name. So vast is thy mercy. How huge then my wretchedness. I can find in this empty life and heart no devotion to thy name. Like that. That's the vibe of the hymn. It's just a devotional poem glorifying the power of the name of God. So he popularized the practice of kirtana, bhajana, but especially japana, just the repetition of the Lord's name. Yes, Amber? Is it possible for somebody to write the book name in the chat? Yes, it's called the Charitamrita. And Amrita means nectar. Charita, maybe I should say something about this book. Charita means story. Like, for instance, in the Chandi, in the Devi Mahatmyam, it's split up into these 3 charitas, starting with the Pratama Charita, the first story, which details the slaying of Madhu and Kaitaba. Then the next few chapters are all the second story, the Madhyama Charita, which details the slaying of Mahishasura. So that's the central episode, and that's the one that's typically depicted. You can see the goddess slaying Mahisha like that. Then the longest episode, and the one in which we meet the Ashtamatrikas, the 8 mothers, and in which we meet Kali, like a very important episode, is called the Uttama Charita, the final episode or the supreme episode. So the word Charita, it can mean story, but it can also have the connotation of like acts in a play. So the Chandi has 3 acts: Pratama Charita, first act; Madhyama Charita, second act; and Uttama Charita, third act. Just like that, Sri Chaitanya's life can be considered a particular leela, a sport or a play of God, because God himself becomes Chaitanya, as we'll discuss presently. In any case, his life is called a charita, a play, an act. And Amrita means nectar. So Charita, Amrita, when you put them together by the rules of Sanskrit, the A at the end of Charita and the A at the beginning of Amrita join by Sandhi to become a long A. So it becomes Charitamrita. And it's a suffix to his name. So Chaitanya, Charitamrita, the nectarian play of Chaitanya. That's the name of the book. And it was composed by a certain Krishnadas Kaviraj in 1581. So it's a pretty ancient book. It was from the 16th century. And Krishnadas Kaviraj, like I was saying in the previous lecture, was a disciple of Raghunatha Dasa, who was an attendant to Sri Chaitanya. So this book is very much like, in a sense, the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, because it was composed somewhat contemporaneously with its subject. So the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, it came out shortly after Sri Ramakrishna left the body. Similarly, the Charitamrita also came out shortly after Chaitanya kicked the body. Nobody really knows how he died. Some people say he was killed. Some people said he just vanished. Some people say he's still alive. Chaitanya, I mean. No, his death is incredibly mysterious, actually. Anyway, that aside, we talk about that in the second of the 4 episodes in the lecture called "Who is Śrī Caitanya, Krishna Chaitanya?" Okay. Then in the 3rd lecture, we talked about just the practices. And there we learned about all the various ways that the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition approaches God. It was very beautiful. We talked about so many different things. And what was exciting was we gave 2 out of those 3 lectures in San Francisco, and the 3rd lecture we gave in Chaitanya's house. And that was particularly special for me. We went to her farm, and there's a bull there, Nandi is his name, and there's Krishna and Balarama, the 2 sheep. And those of you who recently came to the retreat in San Francisco, it was in that house that we gave that lecture. Way back when, before they even properly moved in, they just started to move in, and they barely had the house set up, so there was no furniture anywhere, which is still kind of like what it looks like now. It's just a floor space for people to come and sing and dance. So that was nice because we did that lecture, and then right after that lecture in Chaitanya's house, we all plunged into some Chaitanya kirtan. They led some kirtan, and we had a nice Vaishnava meal, a very light and vegetarian Vaishnava meal. So that was nice. I really enjoyed giving that talk in that particular setting. And I thought it was a pretty inspired talk, actually, because Chaitanya was there and Sumeruji was there, and the community was, you could feel it was a very charged space, probably because their house is so holy. Guyeshwari Kali is there now, but even back then it was so powerful. And I thought the lecture was, I definitely felt something very special in that lecture. So that was the 3rd lecture. Then I just couldn't leave the topic alone. Gaur Purnimā had passed, but then the next opportunity I had, the very next lecture after that, I think it was the Friday right after that, I think, if I'm not mistaken, we did a special talk on Narada's definition of bhakti compared to Chaitanya's definition of bhakti compared to Ramakrishna's definition of bhakti. And so in that lecture, I wanted to point out some of the similarities and differences between these different masters when it came to the philosophy and practice of bhakti, devotion to God. So those are the 4 lectures that we've given so far. And just now we did the 5th. Jaima, Amber. So just now we did the 5th. And the 5th was, I guess we'll call it something like Gaudiya Vaishnava Tantra, or Introduction to Gaudiya Vaishnava Tantra, or something like that, where we talked about the parameters of Vaishnava Tantra and most importantly, some of the key practices of Tantra and how they apply in this context. So we talked about the Rādhā Gayatri mantra and the Rādhā Dhyana mantra. We said a few things about her Mula mantra, and we talked about the yantra, that beautiful yantra with the 6 petals and then the 10 petals and the 8 petals and the 10 mini petals and that Kama Bija in the center and the pulse and throb of that yantra, all of that stuff. So that was exciting. Now what I want to do, if you don't mind, is I want to be a little more philosophical in our approach and make a few comparisons between acintya, bhedābheda and some of the other schools of philosophy to try to articulate a tantric philosophy, if you will, from all of this. So what's the worldview here? And how can we incorporate that worldview into our own spiritual practice? So I'm hoping that this will be immensely practical because there's so much that we can learn from the Gaudiya Vaishnava Tantric approach that will ennoble us in whatever sadhana that we're doing. But of course, I want to take a more philosophical approach. So we'll talk about some subtler things if you don't mind. Okay. First, I want to say this though. Tantra doesn't really concern itself with philosophy too much. The Tantras themselves have a short philosophical treatise at the beginning. Hello, Wilson G. So good to see you. Zachary G. So the Tantras, they do have philosophical discussions, usually at the very beginning, but they're quite thin. They're not very elaborate philosophical presentations. The focus of the Tantra is on practice. It's almost as if the Tantra says, never mind philosophy. It doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter what your worldview is. Like, do the Tantra. In other words, do the mantras in this particular sequence, visualize the yantras in this way, make these particular offerings at these particular times, and you will, make no mistake, get a result. So that's the focus of the Tantra. It's on praxis, it's on application, and then you just see for yourself. It's like, why should the Tantra waste breath and waste ink trying to explain the ultimate nature of reality to you? They prefer to just show you rather than teach you or explain to you or talk at you. They prefer to just like take you to the source firsthand so you can come face to face with that reality from which all the philosophies come anyway. That's the beauty of Tantra. Now, in this, there's already a philosophy. The philosophy that ultimate reality can and should be experienced. So that's like axiom number one in Tantra. Anybody, anywhere, through the right method and the right application, can verify for themselves the truths of religion. This is a stunning claim and it's intensely tantric in nature. The Tantras are an upaya shastra, a doctrine of means and methods. They merely prescribe techniques and procedures, if you will, whereby you can have this vision for yourself. This is contrast with, oh, sorry, I knocked the mic out. This is markedly in contrast major world religions who generally tend to argue that this spiritual experience can be had only by a select few. So there are prophets who at a certain time in history have had this experience, and there it starts and there it ends. So now we have to take what they said on faith because we have no chance of verifying that experience, which importantly was the source of what they said. So even in these religions, there's a, what do you call it, a concession being made that no religion exists that is not premised on experience. The question is just about the democracy of experience. So who gets to have those experiences? And in certain religions, the prophets get to have that experience, but other people don't for a variety of reasons. And there's some value to that too, of course. But in the Tantras, the argument is that no, everybody can and everybody should. And with this procedure, with this method, you will have the experience. The same experience that the prophets who composed these Tantras had. The same experience that all the prophets in the world religion had, you should be able to have also. So that's like the first axiom of Tantra. Truth is directly, tangibly perceivable. And so this, of course, is Sri Ramakrishna's central teaching. God can be seen. And by seen here means the darshana, the darshan of Ishvara. By seen means tangibly, palpably felt through and through in every possible way. So Sri Krishna was God experienced in a particular way, if you will. By whom? Well, by all those who have had that experience. So Sri Krishna, you can argue, is a particular reading of God. Just like Shiva, just like Kali, just like Jesus, just like Buddha, are all each of them equally valid readings of God. But God remains one and the same throughout. So that's the second axiom. I think that's the next thing we can get from Tantra as a philosophy. God can be seen, and importantly, God can be seen in diverse ways, in myriads of ways, because that one reality is infinitely rich. Hence, the tantric world is generally a world of proliferation of deities. That's one of the features of Tantra. Like before Tantra, there are less deities. After Tantra, there are more deities. So Tantra tends to diversify the forms of God, either through mantra or through yantra or through vigraha. That is through a sacred sound or sacred geometry or some kind of anthropomorphic or zoanthropomorphic presentation. The Tantra tends to offer more ways of conceiving that one. So if you say Shiva, the moment Tantra comes, Shiva becomes Bhairava, who becomes like Asitanga Bhairava and Ruru Bhairava and Chanda Bhairava and Sanghara Bhairava, and you see all the different Bhairavas, these Ashta Bhairavas. There are 8 new forms that are all variations on the central form called Bhairava, who is himself a tantric variation on the form of Shiva. You see? So Tantra tends to proliferate deities. Take, for instance, Devi. Once you start with this idea of Shakti, the Tantra comes in and says, well, there are 8 of them. And those 8 are 8 aspects of one Devi. So her name might be Ambika, but she can be expressed as Brahmi or Indrani or Vaishnavi or Varahi, like that. So these are the Ashtamatrikas. Then, when it comes to Kali, they further stratify Kali. In the very esoteric Shakta world, they say there are 12 aspects to this Kali. And that's Shrishti Kali, Rakta Kali, like that, Sthitinasha Kali, and all those 12 Kalis that we've been talking about recently. They're different Kalis, it seems, but they're different aspects of one and the same Kali. And then, of course, there's the Dasha Mahavidyas, which were more familiar with. They're also very secret, but they've recently enjoyed a bit more popularity in the mainstream. So Kali, Tara, Shodashi, Bhuvaneshwari, Bhairavi, Chinnamastaka, Dhumavati, Bagla, Matangi, Kamala, and this list changes. From Tantra to Tantra, this list can actually change. Durga is sometimes a Mahavidya, interestingly, right? And instead of Kamala, it's Lakshmi, for instance, another name for Kamala. And sometimes some of the deities that you expect to be in this list, they aren't, and they're replaced by other deities like Jeshta, for instance. Instead of Dhumavati, another name for Dhumavati is Jeshta. But Jeshta is a different deity, it seems like. So there are varying lists of the Ashtamatrikas, of the Dasha Mahavidyas, maybe sometimes not even 10. It's Mahavidyas, but there are less than 10 or more than 10, 13, 12, for instance. Then there's the 15 Kalis, the Nitya Kali. So see, you can see how Tantra has this effect of diversifying a deity without, importantly, contradicting the central unity of that deity. This idea you're going to find in acintya, bhedābheda. The very name of the philosophy implies this. Bheda means difference, abheda means non-difference. So bhedābheda means that philosophy which recognizes difference in non-difference. That's very tantric actually, because Tantra as a philosophy seems to make this concession right at the beginning, that there are many ways of thinking of one thing. It's still one, but you cannot deny that these distinctions do inhere. Now, abheda, non-duality, will say, look, there's only one, and they will attempt to get rid of the differences in favor of oneness. So a homogeneous unity is to be achieved at all cost. That's the risk of Advaita. You lose diversity, you lose richness, you lose color. So, and it's a trope, because if you go to like a purely Advaitic teacher, you'll see that they are minimal through and through. For instance, if they're giving a lecture, at most you can expect one clear cup of water on the table and maybe some flowers. Right? And their presentation will also be very austere. For instance, they'll be very usually wearing very simple clothes. They might appear to be a very simple person also, which is wonderful. And their presentation will be very simple. They'll try to use minimum words and speak very slowly. And I often make fun of this, but I don't mean to. It's perfectly valid. And they like to say that everything is false. Why? In service of non-duality, abheda. So they'll say, world is false. You often see like Rameshwar Maharaj or Nisargadatta Maharaj. Not so much Ramana, but some of those other more radical Advaitins. They'll say, this is false, that is false. Every single thought is false. Silence, 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 stillness. Ramana, Sumairu, just be silent, be still. So it's a minimal sort of approach, and it's perfectly valid. In this Advaita, you feel perfect unity only. There is just one. And so here, even the attributes disappear. Like Sat, Chit, Ananda, that's the most you can say. But in truth, it's oneness without any quality, without any characteristic, without any distinction. And this oneness, if taken to an extreme, is experienced as being in and of itself, not a being or a person, but just pure being. Then, even in theism, when you say God is one, you will reject in the favor of Advaita any form of God that isn't that one. So this you find with like Abrahamic traditions and some traditions in Hinduism. They'll say there is God and God is one, and any other form other than ours is not true. Again, that's an attempt to attain abheda, non-duality. On the other end of the spectrum, you have polytheism. So whether it's Advaita non-theism or whether it's monistic theism, that's one end of the spectrum. But on the other end of the spectrum, they say, no, there's not one, there's many. There's so many gods. There's this god and that god, and they all rule different parts of nature, and they're all distinct from one another. There's no oneness behind it all. This is polytheism proper, and it too is valid. It too is perfectly fine. But in the Vedas, you find a kind of middle ground where a sort of polytheistic model is offered, but reconciled in the light of the one that mysteriously hangs back behind all of these various nature gods like Vayu and Agni and Soma and Indra and whatnot. Behind all of these various presentations of nature, there is the one in whom all these forms live and of whom these forms are but a symbol. So that you find in the Vedas, and you definitely find that in the Tantras too, where one is expressed, but many is also admitted. So this concession, if you will, between diversity and non-diversity is made in the Tantras. And that's why this philosophy of Chaitanya is very special, and it lends itself very nicely to the Tantras also, because it's called bhedābheda, the doctrine of difference in non-difference. Now, importantly, like we were saying in that previous lecture, it's called acintya bhedābheda. Because the moment you say something is both one and many, immediately you've contradicted yourself. The non-dualist will say, that's ridiculous. You're saying milk is both white and black. How can a thing have two qualities? Or how can a thing be described in contradictory terms? That choose one or the other. This doesn't fly. And the other polytheists might say the same thing. Like, you can't say it's one and then say it's many, because those two things contradict one another. So it's a concession, but it's a concession that doesn't do well logically. And insofar as you're interested in maintaining logical precision, insofar as you want a rationalistic, reasonable philosophy, bhedābheda doesn't really quite cut it. It doesn't really work. And if you want it to work, you might have to stratify it. You might have to say, there's difference, but only on this order of reality. But on a higher order of reality, it's perfect non-difference. Or you can flip that. You could say, it might appear to be totally non-dual from this lower level reality. But once you get to the real, the ultimate nature of reality, you'll see that it's all different. So you can play this game where you can get both, but only if you stratify them. And that's not necessarily what the acintya bhedābheda school wants to do. They want to say, at the highest level of reality, both difference and non-difference in here. So you'll see this in Tantra also. They'll say, oh, well, ultimately she's one. Right now, just because you don't know that, you have to work with all of these forms. So it's like a concession that you can't have both. You can't have your cake and eat it too. So you say one is merely a means and the other is an ends. The ends is Advaita, non-duality, because God is only one. But the means can include various forms like that. So you get this tone sometimes in Tantra. But I think some Tantras and some Tantric philosophers are quite bold. They're like, no, fine. I accept your contradiction. I don't need to explain myself. I'm willing to sacrifice logical consistency. I'm willing to sacrifice philosophy in the name of my realization, which doesn't fit so nicely into your neat categories of linguistic, logical worldviews. It's bhedābheda. That's what I have to say about it. And I will admit it's contradictory. So I'll call it acintya, unthinkable. Acintya, chinta means to think. So acintya means unthinkable diversity and non-diversity. It's both many and one. And so that's another thing, another feature of this philosophy that I think is quite tantric. The philosophy focuses on having a direct experience of Sri Krishna, importantly, an ecstatic experience of Sri Krishna. It admits of diversity while maintaining non-diversity, and it also diversifies the forms of worship. So if you're approaching this from one view, Krishna is the Purushottama. He's the be-all, end-all. He's God. So worship just God. Worship just Krishna. But what the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition does is it introduces new figures that are as worship-worthy, if not more worship-worthy, than Sri Krishna. So for instance, now you get the introduction of Rādhā, Rādhā Rani. So in the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, Rādhā, according to some traditions, takes a higher role than Sri Krishna, if you will. So the way this works is Sri Krishna is the one reality, and he has Shakti. But that Shakti comes in a few different forms. There's one form of his Shakti called Maya Shakti. Now, this is the most peripheral of his powers. Maya Shakti is Sri Krishna's power to manifest insentient things. In other words, to create an insentient world. Now remember, in Hindu cosmology or in the Puranic worldview, nature is not sentient, right? Oh no, there are many people who have Rādhā as an Ishta, and that's very much available in the Gaudiya Vaishnava community. In fact, otherwise there wouldn't be a Rādhā Ishta mantra, for instance. Like I was just talking in the last lecture about the Rādhā Ishta mantra. Many people receive that as their Diksha mantra. And the mantra is so exciting because it's got two bijas and it ends with Swaha and it's Rādha's name. It's very beautiful. And if I was a Gaudiya Vaishnava, which I'm not, I guess you could say, no, I mean, to some extent we are, since we're in the lineage of Sri Ramakrishna. But that would probably be, if I could get a choice in the matter, my choice, it would be Rādhā, of course, through and through, because we're Shakta, so generally we'll tend to. So, but again, that form becomes available in Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Let's explain how. So, Krishna has these Shaktis. Now, in the Puranic worldview, in the Bhagavata worldview, the world is insentient. Remember, in Sankhya, the world is not seen as a being, it's matter. And this is a startlingly modern view, actually. For 1000 BCE India, arguably this view emerged even earlier than that. Like, this is startlingly in keeping with our modern scientific theories about nature. we can be awed by nature, we can feel reverence for nature, but scientifically speaking, nature isn't a person. You know, you can mythologize her as such. Just today, you know what? Something very funny happened. I was at the, so we went to the New Dwarka, which is the ISKCON temple near where we live. It's called New Dwarka. So we went to go see Sri Krishna and Sri Radha, and we went to go and eat the prasad, the Gaur Purnimā prasad. They had a beautiful procession. Unfortunately, I didn't get to stay for it because I had to go to work and do my Gopala Puja there. But it was nice to see everyone was in a festive mood. So we went, and there were many people there naturally because it's such a special day for the Vaishnava community. So we walked into the like cafeteria. It's called Govinda's. It's the natural foods vegetarian cafe. Very light, very hippie appropriate food. You know, so a lot of like hippie types also come there. It's the 60s and 70s haven't ended usually at these ISKCON communities. All these. Anyway, so there's a guy there. And he was an Indian. I can't say he was Caucasian, but he was definitely not Indian. And he was speaking to an Indian, like a very like Indian auntie type, who obviously is from maybe Bengal or somewhere. She had a rather thick accent, and clearly she's not from America. She's not an American Indian. She's an Indian from India who's come to America. Okay, so they're having a conversation, and I'm ordering at the line. And then as she's walking away, he asks her, "So what's your name?" And this Indian auntie type, she says, "Gayatri Devi." And he struggles to get it. He's like, and then it's talking a little bit, and he's like, "Okay, Gayatri Devi." Okay, cool. And she's walking, and he goes, "Do you know what Gayatri means?" And I almost like dropped my tray because I'm like, this guy is about to mansplain to this Indian woman the meaning of her name. Just so funny, because that's what he was doing anyway. Like in the course of the conversation, he was just like mansplaining a bunch of like very hippie sounding kind of concepts in spirituality. He was explaining like Buddha is Jesus, like that. He's like saying something like, so he's like, well, actually, do you know what Gayatri means? And she didn't say anything. She was just like, huh? Because Gayatri. But then I was shocked. He didn't actually explain like, oh, it's from the Vedas, it's the Savitri Gayatri, it's a particular meter. He went, it means Gaia's tree. And I was like, oh, that's good actually. See his the kind of like hippie new age take on it. It's like Gaia is nature and it's Gaia's tree. I was like, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's sweet because like sometimes in spirituality, the first step in spirituality is trying to see divinity in nature, which is kind of tiresome to the Indian mind sometimes because we were all up in that shit in like 9000 BCE, you know? Like we did it for a couple thousand years. We're kind of over it. We're over this like nature is holy, man, kind of thing. It's like it's a phase, and then you realize that like yeah, yes it is, but there's something even further than that. But in the beginning, that it's a huge step up from like a materialistic worldview of like a mechanistic universe. Like no, there's something sacred about all this. You know, it's like something's going on here, like that feeling. But it's a religious and spiritual feeling. But in the world of science, that's not actually how they approach nature. Nature is a substance, it's matter, and it can be studied, and you can still have every bit of reverence for it. It's just that you won't necessarily deify it, though Einstein did, I think. Einstein, he admitted to being a pantheist, but in like a Spinoza kind of way. Anyway, we don't need to get into that right now. But nature is sacred, no doubt, because that which is sacred in nature is called God. And so these forces of nature were deified as early as the Vedas. In any case, by the time you get to the Puranas, the dominant worldview is that nature is inert. It's Prakriti. And Prakriti is not a being, it's raw material, which the one being, God, uses to sculpt a world in which these beings, individual souls, exist. So the world is not sentient. In fact, nobody actually thinks it is. For all their talk that nature is holy, you'll see that they won't actually save a rock instead of a human in a burning building. That's an important admission, you know, because it means on some level we understand that sentiency and insentiency can be distinguished. And so nature as a whole depicts a very vast complex of thoughts, but plants and animals are still going to be somewhat higher than like rocks and, you know, like water and things like that. And of course, there are people who say water has a memory and whatnot. But ultimately, when we regard things in the world, tables, chairs, etc., we tend to regard them as if they are inert. And actually, John Paul Sartre has an important argument here. He says, how do you know that other people exist? Like, how do you solve the problem of other minds? He says in exactly this way, shame. You feel ashamed to do a shameful thing in front of someone. Why? If they weren't another person, if you didn't on some level know that they were there watching you, you wouldn't feel ashamed to do what you were about to do. So shame, although it's socially conditioned, is actually a clue. It tells you that you recognize other people's selfhood, rightly or wrongly. And he uses that as a proof for other people's selfhood. But you don't feel that same shame necessarily in front of a tree. Although you somewhat recognize that it's sentient, not quite in the way that you recognize other human beings are sentient. And sometimes you might feel a bit ashamed to do something in front of your dog if you're an American, because usually, in America, dogs have a slightly higher ontological status. But, sometimes you'll do whatever in front of your dog, and you'll do whatever in front of the tree, but you won't do that same thing in front of like a stranger. Isn't that interesting? So on some level, there's this admission of at least lower sentience, if not insentience altogether, in nature. Now, insentience, it doesn't have to be pejorative. It just means materiality. So Krishna has his peripheral Shakti, which means he can manifest inert, insentient objects, jaratva. This is called Maya. Now, slightly more exalted than this Shakti is what is called Jiva Shakti. So Krishna also has the ability to create souls, as it were. Now, this is not always commonly held among schools of Indian philosophy. There are many schools of Indian philosophy, like many Shaiva schools, for instance, that argue souls are coexistent with God. So God doesn't create souls. God can create a world in which souls can play and work out their karmas, but God cannot actually create souls because souls themselves are beginningless and endless. I think the same view is kind of maintained here to some extent, but the souls themselves, jivas, you and me, all of us here in this room, we are an expression of Krishna's power. So we don't have to say that Maya began at any point and Maya will end at any point. Maya just exists as long as Krishna exists. And similarly, as long as Krishna exists, which is forever and always, he is existence itself, so too will jivas exist. So I'm not saying that God created the jivas, nor am I saying that God created Maya, meaning the world of materiality or inert objectivity. Those just exist as eternal powers of Krishna, but they're peripheral powers, importantly. The Maya Shakti is his most peripheral power, and then Jiva Shakti is one step above that. And then there's something else. The next thing is called Swarupa Shakti. This is where it gets very important. So Swarupa Shakti means Krishna's ability to enjoy himself, particularly captured by the word Hladini. So Swarupa Shakti also has a few stratifications, but I want to just stick to this one concept for now. The word is Hladini. I'll put it in the chat. It's such a beautiful word, even. Hladini. And Hladini means bliss power. Hladini Shakti, if you will. Hladini Shakti. Krishna's bliss power. So Krishna can create a world. No, Krishna's power is the world. I think that's a more technically precise way of saying it. Krishna's power is individual souls, but Krishna's most coveted power, his most essential power, is called Hladini, which is his ability to savor his own sweetness. Doesn't this sound familiar? This is exactly the tantric idea of prakasha and vimarsha. So prakasha means the ability to shine. Vimarsha means the ability to self-reflect. And prakasha, Shiva, and vimarshini, Shakti, are both essential, I don't want to say aspects, I don't want to say characters, I don't want to say attributes. I want to say essential readings of reality, if you will. There is reality, and reality is both consciousness and its ability to be self-conscious. Now, this is important. This is what distinguishes tantric philosophy from other forms of philosophy, because Advaita Vedanta won't admit this. Advaita Vedanta will admit prakasha, but they will never admit vimarsha. And they'll say, how can a thing be an object to itself? If it's the subject, it cannot be an object. And if it is possible for it to be an object to itself, then you will end up with an infinite regress. Because if I can see myself seeing myself, then necessarily I should also be able to see myself seeing myself seeing myself. And therefore I should be able to see myself seeing myself seeing myself see myself. And therefore I should be able to see myself seeing myself seeing myself seeing myself see myself. And then I should be able to see myself seeing myself seeing myself seeing myself seeing myself see myself. Right? You see, you get this infinite regress where you get this ever receding goalpost of subjectivity. Then there's no subject. And if there's no subject, then there's no object. The fact that there is an object means that there must be a subject. And that subject can never be an object to itself. I mean, your eyes can never see themselves in real time. The eyes are the subject, and the world appears as an object. At most, you can see a reflection of your eyes in like a Zoom screen or something like that, or in a mirror or in a selfie, but you will never be able to actually see your own eyes. I was telling my middle schoolers about this, And of course, naturally, they always find like a smart ass way around every single argument that we ever make in class, which I love, by the way. But it's exasperating because we can never get to the point of the Vedantic teaching because every step of the way we're being like questioned, which actually really helps really refine these philosophies. Anyway, so one kid, I remember he said this. I've heard this a lot actually, startlingly too many times. The kid was like, "Oh yeah, your eyeballs can't see themselves. Well, what if you like plucked out one of the eyeballs, but the optic nerve was still there, and then you were able to like, he had this really gruesome way of describing self-seeing." But anyway, that aside, I don't know if that would work or not. Generally, the eyeballs can't see themselves in real time. That's proof. It's called the principle of self-reflexivity. A screw cannot screw it. A screwdriver cannot screw itself. A doorknob cannot turn itself. A knife cannot cut itself. A knife might be able to cut other knives and vegetables, but a knife can never cut itself. That's an important point, actually. Because the argument here, yeah, that's exactly right, Jamie. Thank you. That's what I told him. I was like, look, I don't want to try it. I don't want you to try it. I don't know anybody who has tried it, and I don't think it's going to work. But like right now, with the data that we have right now, it's quite obvious that the eyeballs will never be able to see themselves. So just go with that, okay? Damn it, Danny. Just go with that. So this means the subject will never be an object to itself. So prakasha is possible. Consciousness shines, but it will never shine on itself or to itself. So consciousness is not, this is important, conscious. Really weird thing to say, but that's what Advaita Vedanta claims. Consciousness is not conscious. To be conscious, you need to have what Advaita Vedanta calls a subtle body, which is here described as chidabhasa. Chidabhasa means reflected consciousness. So it's only when consciousness is reflected in a mind that the mind can know itself as such. But once the mind is gone, there is no more talk of experiencing. There's just pure being. And it's inconceivable because it's to a mind that this vision of reality is being presented. Yeah, and exactly, Kaleshwari, you're right. Plus, another problem is that, well, that eye, which is now the subject, will be seeing another eye, which is an object. The principle still stands, actually. That eye, which you disambiguated from the socket, will never still see itself. So you're right, Kaleshwari, that still stands, actually. But this is exactly the argument that Advaita Vedanta will use to dismiss Vimarsha. Consciousness is conscious, but it's not, importantly, self-conscious. For to be self-conscious is for a subject to be its own object, which either will lead to infinite regress or is just purely linguistically, grammatically, and logically incoherent. How can the subject be an object? Therefore, how can awareness know itself? That's a function of the mind and the way that awareness reflects in the mind. So I can't tell you how many back and forth conversations we've had when Swami Sarvapriyananji visits us here because we're trying to figure out like to what extent is Swat Prakasha the same as Vimarsha. And when I was doing the Vedanta Life Academy, a lot of the audience were like hardcore Advaita Vedanta bros, right? Because they're there because of, like Swami Vivekananda, Swami Sarvapriyananji. So they're very like, what do you call it? Advaita, the slang word would be Advaita pilled, but specifically Advaita Vedanta pilled, So they're like, okay, so what you're talking about, Vimarsha Shakti, that's just Swat Prakasha. Swami Sarvapriyananji would say absolutely not. Why? Because in certain texts like Chitsuki, there are like 9 reasons why Swat Prakasha is not Vimarsha. Many ways of distinguishing these two things. Swat Prakasha is the Advaita Vedanta word, which means self-luminous. And I once asked at lunch or at dinner or something, I asked Swami Sarvapriyananji, I said, to what extent is consciousness being not self-conscious the same as it just being inert? Like, how do you reply in Advaita Vedanta to the accusation of Jaratva? Your absolute Brahman is nothing better than a pot. You Advaita Vedantas like to use pots so much as your analogy. See, your ultimate reality has also become a pot. What's the point? It's consciousness, but it's not conscious. At that point, might as well just be a Buddhist. Why do you still posit something? It's not something or anything. It's some reality that can never know itself. What's the point? It's just a pot. And then the response, of course, is Svat Prakasha. It shines. It has self-shining, Swat Prakasha. But that's not quite Vimarsha. In what sense is it not quite Vimarsha? We discovered that really only in this sense. Vimarsha also implies action, Kartritva. But in Advaita Vedanta, Swat Prakasha does not imply Kartritva. That's, I think, the only difference we could really finally discover between the two things. But yeah, self-shiny, that's the idea. Swat prakasha, self-shiny. And the question is, if you're self-shiny, to whom do you shine? And Advaita Vedanta will say, never to yourself. And what Tantric non-duality wants to say, always to yourself. You're shiny, you're self-shiny, and you are the one who appreciates the shine. You shine to yourself. And that's called vimarsha. So in Tantric non-duality, in the Shaiva world, the word prakasha refers to Shiva, which means pure consciousness, almost synonymous with the Brahman of Advaita Vedanta, plus, and this Advaita Vedanta won't admit, plus something else. And that extra thing is called Shakti, which importantly is non-different from Shiva. So Shakti is inherent in Shiva, and Shakti is Vimarsha, Shiva's ability to savor himself. So Shiva plus Shakti equals the ultimate nature of reality, which is called Paramashiva. And if you say Shiva plus Shakti, it's almost like saying one thing plus another thing together as a compound makes the ultimate nature of reality. Confusingly, we're not saying that at all. What you call Shiva, another person will call Shakti. And what another person calls Shakti is Shiva. And you can even argue that Shakti is the essential nature of Shiva. What is Shiva? Essentially, it's self-reflection. What it is to be Shiva essentially is to be and to know that you are. So in this tantric world, it's not a philosophy of being. In fact, this quote might be quite helpful. It's not a philosophy of being. It's a philosophy of revelation. In Advaita Vedanta, it's a philosophy of being. The ultimate nature of reality is being in and of itself. That's the truth. And you are that. Tattvamasi Shvetaketu. You are that being in and of itself. But in tantric non-duality, it's a being in and of itself, which is constantly revealing itself to itself ecstatically. And so it's a doctrine not of being, but a doctrine of revelation. So to be very delicate here, and to make a very precise and subtle point, we have to say that a tantric philosophy, a tantric non-dual philosophy, will usually admit this fact, that in a light's ability to shine, you get also a self-shining, a self-reflexive knowing. So here we're positing consciousness. In this case, it's called Sri Krishna, but importantly, consciousness with the ability to know itself. So consciousness that is conscious. So to make it very simple, Advaita Vedanta says consciousness only. In fact, that's why Shankara school can be called Kevala Advaita, non-duality only. Whereas Tantric non-duality says consciousness which is conscious. So consciousness which is also conscious. Knowledge that knows. Existence that is self-aware. And this is given the term Shakti. So no different with acintya bhedābheda. Krishna, the Purushottama, the Supreme Spirit, is inseparable from his Shakti, which is here called Hladini. And Hladini, importantly, carries the connotation of not just self-revelation, but also self-enjoyment. It has the idea of bliss. It's blissful. You get that in Shaivism too. It's called Ananda Shakti. And Ananda Shakti is synonymous with Vimarsha, synonymous with Spanda. But here it's particularly emphasized. God is super tasty. And the Hladini is God just licking itself like a cat. God tasting itself. So they importantly personify this Hladini in the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition. They personify it as Rādhā, Rani. So at this point, I'm speaking only in terms of ontic principles. In other words, I'm speaking of tattvas. I'm not yet speaking about the historical personages to which the names Krishna and Rādhā belong. I haven't yet started talking about the world. I'm talking about the ideal world or the metaphysical absolute like that. So Krishna here should be understood to mean the absolute principle of reality, and Radha here should be understood to mean that Hladini Shakti, which is the absolute's ability to delight in itself. Swarupa Shakti, specifically Hladini Shakti. We covered this to some extent in that lecture called Chaitanya's Philosophy of Devotion, but I just wanted to highlight it again here. Okay, so now we have this Hladini Shakti. So, Krishna is Purushottama, the ultimate nature of reality, and Radha is Hladini Shakti, the absolute's ability to enjoy itself. The question then comes, which is better? Of course, this is a weird question to ask because they're non-different. The Swarupa Shakti, in the very word, by the way, Swarupa, implies that it's essentially the same, one and the same thing. So you can't ask which is better, but if you really push the point, if you really pointed out that these were two aspects of one, and you asked which aspect is to be preferred maybe, which isn't necessarily saying which is better, then you might say Radha actually. What would be the point to being Krishna without Radha. In other words, what would be the point to being an absolute if there wasn't some joy to it? Since Hladini is the joy of the absolute, it's therefore the meaning and purpose and reason for the absolute. So you could almost argue that God exists for God's devotee. Without the devotee, God has no purpose. God is in almost a sense, in some sense, the absolute response to love, and love desires an object. So God is ultimately the object, the supreme object, the object which is most beloved. But it is a reflex or a response, dare I say, of the lover. So in the very exalted philosophy of Swami Vivekananda, we get the idea that God is love. Wherever you see a kitten being nursed by its mother, stand and pray, Swami Vivekananda said, because you are in the presence of love. And in describing Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda said he is Love personified. So God is love, and love is not necessarily a noun. Love is a verb. And love is directional. And insofar as love is directional, it's love for, or I should say, love is intentional, to use a more philosophically accurate phrase. Love is intentional the way consciousness is intentional. Consciousness is always consciousness about something. I'm conscious of Asha Devi. I'm conscious of something, you see? So similarly, I love, you must put something there, usually. And if you love love itself, no problem. Love is the noun and love is the verb. The noun form of love is called Krishna, and the verb form of love is called Radha. How about that? Still love, same thing, but it's two movements within love. And so Radha, Hladini, is love as a verb, and Krishna, the Purushottama, is love as a noun, and it's to that noun that the verb is attributed. Which is more important then? So you could argue the noun and the verb are non-different, but the noun is a response almost to the verb. Radha becomes more important. So in the Shaiva world, you could argue that Shiva without Icha here means will, and will also has the connotation of love and joy. Shiva without Icha is just Shava, he's just a corpse. What's the point? But with Kali dancing on top of him, he has meaning. She is his meaning, and he is her being. So the meaning of the being is called Radha. She is therefore exalted above Krishna in some Gaudiya Vaishnava communities. And of course, I'm quite partial to these communities. So now, let's take a step down. Actually, not even a step down. I think this is a step up, actually. But I want to move from the realm of the ideal to the realm of the actual. So by actual, I mean historic. So in historicity, I don't know how you say that word exactly, there was a person that they say lived and moved amongst us, and his name was Krishna. And importantly, he was God and is God. So the same Krishna that I was just talking about a moment ago, that fella took form in his history as a human being who had a wife, who had friends, who was the king of a kingdom, who was part of Indian civilization, and he was God. So the idea that God can incarnate as a person was first articulated probably philosophically by the Bhagavad Gita, way before Christianity got its hands on this doctrine, way before the idea of the avatara was even spoken of anywhere else in the world. First in the Bhagavad Gita, the philosophy of the avatara was offered. Yada yada hi dharmasya. These are the arguably the opening words of Avatara Vada, the doctrine of the incarnation the world had ever heard. And it said that whenever there is adharma, from time to time, yada yada, I come, I incarnate myself as a person in order to bring balance to the force, so to speak. So this is verse 7, chapter 4 of the Bhagavad Gita. That's where you get this idea that God is man for the first time. So, of course, Krishna is in India's mind the most popular avatara. But it's argued that in the Ramayana, so too is Rama. Like Rama comes specifically to restore balance to the force, to destroy Ravana, who was becoming too big for his britches at that point. So God himself, Vishnu Narayana, assumes the form of Rama in order to destroy Ravana. So Rama is a guy. He existed, and he had a wife, and he had friends, and he played a part in Indian civilization. Like he's in the history book as an actual king, or rather an actual prince. But he's also God. That's a remarkable idea that God, who creates everything, plays in his creation sports in his creation in order to achieve some kind of end, like to teach humans something or to bring balance to the force, something like that. So God incarnates as Rama, God incarnates as Krishna. Then, like I was saying in the last lecture, there's this book called the Bhagavata, which is the core doctrine for the Vaishnavas in all the different sects of Vaishnavism. And there you get lots of avatars, not just Rama, it's not just Krishna. So many. There's like Nrsimha, who is the man lion, and there's so many different forms of God that take historicity, if you will. So Jesus is but one of many. And so in the Western tradition, or it's hard to say whether this is an Occidental tradition at all, but in the Oriental Occidental tradition called Christianity, only one avatara is admitted, Jesus. But in the Hindu tradition, or rather the again, I don't want to say Hindu, but in this world of the Puranas and the Bhagavad Gita, innumerable avatars are admitted. According to some, there are 10. According to others, there are innumerable. But from time to time, God becomes a person. That's the next idea that we have to stress. What makes this tantric? So I want to suggest that the Avatara Vada, the doctrine of the incarnation of God itself, is intensely tantric. Because remember, Tantra argues that the formless, that which is beyond the mind, that which is beyond the language, can be approached through form. That somehow there is a relationship between form and the formless. That somehow the form adequately captures the formless in this mysterious way. Ramanuja calls it the Avatara Archana, or sorry, the Archana Avatara, the idea that God descends and, or rather, condescends to be present in a murti. Why should God be in the stone? God is God. God is everywhere. And yet, I'm sitting in front of a murti and praying to this piece of stone as if it's God. Now, according to Ramanuja in the Sri Vaishnava community, God's grace is such that he condescends to be worshipped that way too. He makes a concession. And Ramanuja gives the example of a king who's on top of a big elephant. You can't reach the king as long as he's on the elephant. You're just like this little peasant and you're like, Raja, to Raja. And the king is up there and he can barely hear you. But should he hear you and should he be a good king, what will be his response? He will bid his elephant rider to stop and have the elephant kneel. And once the elephant kneels, then you can come face to face with the king. Same king. A moment ago, he was up there. Now he's down here looking you in the eyes. And so the elephant kneeling is a very important metaphor in the Ramanuja worldview. It's God's concession. So God is formless, but because the mind loves form, God condescends, as it were, to appear in form. And one version of that is the avatara, who exists in historicity. Another version of that is the murti. The murti is also an avatara in a sense. It's called the Archana avatara, God's manifestation in some object. So it is possible in the tantric world to approach formlessness through form, and we argue that it's better to do it that way. The mind, it doesn't really respond too well to formlessness, at least not in a sustained way. It's hard to do like a sadhana for 15, 20 years. A lot of people come but they're beginners, and it shows because they are resistant to form and they only like formlessness. But sooner or later, I've noticed they mellow out in a way. They start to realize that while they might intellectually prefer the formless, it's not as spiritually nourishing as approaching that through some form. So Tantra says, go through the form, because then it's more likely that you will achieve the formless. So be practical at every step. Don't be trapped in the dogma that God is only formless. Be willing to accept the help that you're given by the tradition. So that's exactly what Christ is. We cannot think of God the Father. It's absolutely unthinkable. Yet, through the grace of the Father, the Son appears. And he who has seen the Son has seen the Father. In other words, the form is nothing but the formless. So the avatara itself, the very fact that the avatara appears, is quite tantric. It's a concession, as it were, that the form is equally viable. Anyway, Ramanuja, I know this is a Chaitanya class, but we keep going Ramanuja for some reason. He argues that one of the reasons for the avatara is to give us new adorable forms to fall in love with. In other words, to keep religion fresh. That's why there should be many of them. There's only one, you'll get bored of it. So that's, I think, a cute idea also, that more avatars is a good thing because it gives the mind more ways to perceive God, and it accommodates more people because each avatar has a particular bhava, like Rama and his righteousness, Krishna and his attractiveness, Narasimha and his power, for instance, Jesus and his austerity and renunciation. Like each of them has a particular flavor which necessarily will appeal to a particular kind of person. So the more, the better. So that's another thing. The Avatara Vada is quite delightful and quite tantric. So as far as tantric elements in Chaitanya's philosophy goes, I think elevating Radha and seeing her as an Ishta in her own right is one element, but also recognizing that God can be a person in historicity is another element. And notice this particular case is important. So Krishna is God, but when Krishna comes, importantly, he has many different leelas. And the central lila of Chaitanya's tradition, the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, is like I was saying in the last lecture, the Ras Lila, which is the bliss that Krishna enjoys with these gopis in the forest of Vrindavan when he was an adolescent. So this is hotly contested. Was he an adolescent? Some people argue if you study the life story of Krishna and you track how old he must have been during this lila, you realize he's like 12 or something. And he's prepubescent. So to depict this in like this erotic way is problematic. It's problematic because the gopis like Radha Rani were probably 10 or 11. Krishna himself was probably only 12. So it would be better and safer for many people to think of this Leela more in the context of like puppy love or like childhood friendship, right? So this is taking a purely like historical approach. Yeah, that's exactly right, Gar. Like in the Bhagavatam, there's so many different forms of Vishnu or God, but especially in the Ras Lila, the question is, he's Krishna. God is Krishna in the Ras Lila, and he's relating to his devotees in a very unique way. See, Narasingha relates to Prahlada in a particular way, right? Or Varaha. Like each of the deities, they each of them, have a certain way of relating to their devotees. But the way that Krishna is relating to the gopis is unique. It's singularly unique because God is now somebody's boyfriend. That's an interesting idea. Not even somebody's husband. Like at least with Sita and Rama, there's this solemnity and gravity to it. They're married. And Sita, importantly, is Lakshmi, and Lakshmi is Vishnu's consort anyway. So when Vishnu comes as Rama, he must come with his consort. Like, no problem, right? They had chaste one-to-one husband-wife love, but this is different. The gopis, they're like people. They're just girls, cowherd girls. And they all had sex with Krishna. And Krishna is God. So what? You can have sex with God? Apparently, yes. But now the question is, what is the nature of that intimate union? Like, is it Sangata? Is it Yamala? Is it like actually sex? Like, are the gopis actually having sex with Krishna? And also importantly, is Krishna as God promoting a sort of adulterous behavior? Because the thing to remember is that the gopis are all of them married, if not all of them, most of them married. And some of them have children. But Krishna is so attractive that they leave their children behind and they leave their pots and pans and household duties behind and they leave their husbands behind to run out into the forest and in the middle of the night sport with this handsome stranger in the woods. Like, what's that about? That's a for conservative Indian society quite a challenging and confronting idea. And the Gaudiya Vaishnavas embrace the idea totally. But of course, with different approaches. Some of them are very apologetic about the whole thing, and they're like, look, it's a metaphor. Don't even begin to interpret this literally. It wasn't like there were literally women who literally went to the forest, who literally made love to Krishna, literally. You know how in California we say literally, but we don't usually mean literally. We mean like actually. The Indian says actually, whereas the American says literally. Both are using the term to mean emphasis, right? So here, I mean, like this whole thing could have just happened as a metaphor. Maybe the gopis represent the nadis, for instance. So there's a way to interiorize all of this. And Krishna is the Shushumna Nadi. And the various gopis are all the nadis. And some say each gopi, yes, as Jamie is pointing out here, each gopi is one verse of the Vedas. So all of these are, again, attempts at Ras Leela apologetics. By apologetics, I mean like reinterpreting it so as to make it more palatable to the conservative masses. But there's also groups who go hardcore to the left with it, to use a tantric phrase. Like they say, no, it's literal, and this is the way that you practice the lila by engaging in adulterous behavior. So there were communities in India, by the way, who glorified adultery. So it's important that you find a paramour because only when you have that kind of forbidden love can you to some extent understand the love that Radha Rani and the gopis had for Krishna, because this was illicit love. The key here is that it's not just regular romantic love, it's illicit love, forbidden love, which carries with it a certain intoxication, a certain excitement, so that you can have exciting romantic trysts with God is one of the central features of the Ras Leela, you see. And how you interpret that, of course, is going to be different from lineage to lineage. In our lineage, my guru always gives this reading. He's like, Krishna was 12. Chill. Right? So our reading is that it's a deep, very abiding kind of love, but a love that is prepubescent and free from um, any kind of like sensual attachment, which for another community is very important, very valuable. And so in that community, they might say they were all adolescents. Krishna might have been 19. The gopis are probably 16 or 17 or something like that. So this is like all the joy that young lovers would have. You know, like your first romance, for instance. This is that. And at that time, the women would be married quite young anyway. So they could be 15 and they would be married. So the fact that they had a child, the fact that they had a husband, doesn't necessarily imply that they're not teenagers. They could have very well been 16 or 17. And importantly, Krishna himself is a teenager. And so that particular relationship setting, which involves like sex, is important. In fact, in the Tantra that we were reading just now, there's that particular dhyana. I didn't talk about it, but it's like you can see the, for lack of a better word, hickeys from last night's events. And it says, you know, you visualize Radha and they're all sitting under a tree and they're talking to Lalita and the gopis and whatnot, and the marks of love are most visible like that. So it's clear that they're having some sort of physical intimacy. So that might be important for some communities. My guru argues it's like puppy love. It's so deep and abiding. You can't deny that there's real intimacy there, but it doesn't necessarily have to involve physicality and sensuality and sexuality. Of course, our friend Babaji Holy Grace is not at all going to like that reading of things. And that's perfectly valid. Some people might want a more saucy reading of this Ras Leela. But importantly, the argument is that it actually happened in history. Yeah, why not both? And that's the idea. Like all of these readings are available. Oh yeah. Oh my God. Right. So she's your sister, but also why not both? But importantly, the Ras Leela has this multivalence to it, which is important because it allows for a lot of different interpretations and a lot of different ways to approach the practice. Anyway, with some communities being very much on the left with it and other communities being very much on the right with it. But still, you can't deny it's a central episode for the Gaudiya Vaishnava community. But I want to point this out. It happened. That's the claim. Whether it actually happened or not, who knows? But the claim is that it happened. There was actually a time in history when a cowherd boy named Sri Krishna, at that time he was probably also called Krishna, seduced, as it were, a group of gopis, and they would go into the forest and they would like swim in the river Yamuna. They would lounge in the shade of the kadamba trees. The gopis would do each other's hair and like weave malika, jasmine flowers, into each other's braids. And every now and then Sri Krishna and Radha would disappear off into the forest. And there was a night when they all went out and each one had their own Krishna, and they were each dancing with their own Krishna in this circle of orgiastic divine joy. And even Shiva took the form of a gopi in order to come and be part of this circle. Like all of that, this whole thing is claimed to have actually happened. And these gopis are actual human beings in historicity. And Radha herself was an actual woman who lived and walked on this earth. And Shri Krishna himself lived and walked on this earth. So this idea that God can be your romantic paramour, that's one of the key features of this Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition. Now, this is where it gets interesting. In this particular Leela, Krishna realizes something. So, I should mention this. The Leelas are happening both historically and also, should I say metaphysically or ideally? Like there's also a divine realm in which this Leela is occurring. And this physical realm is a mirror for that divine realm, maybe in some Platonic or Neoplatonic way. And then in this world, historically it happened, but it happened at a particular place at a particular time. But spiritually, it's happening all the time. It's an eternal Leela, like Krishna and Radha and the gopis and Vrindavana. In the spiritual realm, that's always going to be the case. So if you go to Vrindavana now, you won't see Sri Krishna literally, but you will see Sri Krishna because he's still there spiritually. And Radha Rani is still there spiritually. And the two of them are still enjoying the same eternal Leelas spiritually. Some people almost feel like this is kind of eerie or spooky, right? Like it's like they're ghosts and they're just like doing this eternally, like ghosts like eternally do their things in their house or something like that. But the question is, who's the ghost? You know, I don't want to spoil any movies for you. Once I watched a film, it had Nicole Kidman in it. But before we watched the film, like we watched it at my friend's house, and then before she put it on, you could see on her TV like all the suggested films. and I immediately saw the first suggested film on the list was Sixth Sense, which immediately clued me into the punchline of this movie. So the movie got spoiled by another movie that I will not spoil, but the question is like, anyway, I'll leave that alone. Yeah, so if you've never seen Sixth Sense, you have to see it because somebody will sooner or later spoil it, and that's one of those films that can really be spoiled. That's why you have to see it. You can't know about the film before you see the film. But yeah, 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 that's the one. That's the one. The Nicole Kidman film. Anyway, that's exactly the film. But the point is, are they ghosts? Okay, here comes the spoiler. The spoiler. Actually, I probably won't. Let's just leave this aside. I don't want to spoil either of those movies for you. But the question is whether which one is real. Like, is the Vrindavana, yeah, is the Vrindavana of the physical world more real than the Vrindavana of the spiritual world? The beauty of this tradition is that they say like both are real. Actually, it really happened. It's not just a metaphor. That's pretty tantric. The idea that the world is real, not an illusion. That's an important idea. Like really, there was this metaphor. There was this event in this particular place in history and in geography. Actually, but also eternally, it's going on there and also everywhere. So there's this Vrindavana Loka, this Goloka, this celestial realm in which Krishna, along with the gopis and gopas, are eternally enjoying the sport that they enjoyed when they were adolescents. That's an important thing. Now, there's a sequel, and that's where I think we'll leave things off today. There's a beautiful sequel that I want to explore. Oh, yeah, true. Folks keep getting younger and they will have a first time seeing it. Yeah, that's true. Okay, so apparently Krishna realizes that there's a drawback to being God. And the drawback is that you cannot enjoy what it is to be a devotee of God. So, just speaking from the point of view of Krishna and Radha in this Leela, whether spiritual or actual, Krishna comes to the realization that like it's better to be Radha. Again, this is the deification of Radha. There's something special about Radha that exalts her even beyond God. Here, the devotee, God's lover, is a little more important than God, the beloved. Sri Ramakrishna would speak this way. He would say, see, Hanuman could jump across the ocean with just the power of Rama's name. But Rama needed a bridge. Rama, God himself, had to like um, construct a bridge or commission a bridge in order to get to Lanka. Hanuman, God's devotee, needed no such thing. Upon the power of the name alone, he was able to jump. His faith was greater than the one in whom his faith was placed. Isn't that a beautiful idea that like almost the love that we have for something is more important than the thing itself? Or the faith that we have is important, not really what we put our faith in. So Sri Ramakrishna would speak in this way. And the Gaudiya Vaishnavas articulated this kind of philosophy that the devotee, after a point of attaining this supreme love, was more important than God. And God was almost craving that experience. Like, obviously, the devotee is God. It's Hladini Shakti at the end of the day, absolutely speaking. But relatively speaking, in this episode of Vrindavana, both spiritual and actual, Krishna thinks to himself, I want a bit of what she's drinking. Whatever it is Radha is enjoying, I wish I could have that. Like, it seems like she gets the better end of the deal. It's better to be God's lover than to be God. They're both mad for each other, right? But she's madder. So then this is where Chaitanya comes in. So Chaitanya, Gauranga, is also, according to the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, an incarnation of God, capital G, the way that Krishna is an incarnation, the way that Rama is an incarnation. Except a slight nuance here. In the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, Krishna is the be all end all God. Like it's not Krishna and then Vishnu is higher. No, Krishna is higher than Vishnu even. And we'll talk. We talked about that actually in the philosophy lecture. I don't need to get back into it. But Krishna is the absolute. Krishna is God, capital G, God, God. And Chaitanya, like Jesus, is an incarnation of God, God. That's why when you see pictures of Chaitanya, like the picture I'm probably going to use for the thumbnail of this video, he has more than one arms, and some of his arms are holding bows and arrows. Others are holding conch and maybe like a flute, and yet others are holding a water pot and a staff or a rosary or something like that. So the thing about Chaitanya is he represents Rama, he represents Krishna, and he represents himself as a monk holding his kamandalu and his staff. Because Chaitanya is a new incarnation, but he's a very special kind of incarnation. And maybe this is the last idea, and then we'll open for a Q&A. The incarnation of Chaitanya Gauranga, the golden limbed one whose birthday it is today, represents Krishna in the mood of Radha. This is a profound and poignant idea to me, that Krishna is an incarnation of God, right? But Krishna and Radha both jointly incarnate as Chaitanya. Isn't that remarkable? So Krishna wanted to know what it was like to be Radha. And so Chaitanya is the answer to that question. He's the fulfillment of that desire. So Chaitanya identifies with Radha because he has this prema, this mahabhava, this supreme love for Krishna. But importantly, he is also Krishna. So it's like self-love. In a sense, it's Vimarsha Shakti, it's Hladini Shakti, enacting itself out in one single individual. This brings to mind, of course, Kaubjika and the goddess Parvati in that particular episode. So she goes off on her own, and later Shiva finds her, giving herself head. And that's why she's called Kaubjika, the hunched back goddess. So she's in some kind of Badho Konasana type pose, some butterfly pose, and she's like hunched over like this, Kaubjika. She's the hunchbacked mother, and she's licking herself. She's licking her own yoni. And Shiva is so stunned and excited. He's like, wow, you've discovered this profound ability. And some people will take this too literally and they're like, ah, so that's why they're practicing all that hatha yoga. That's what it's for. But of course, here you can take it actually, but you can also take it metaphorically. I think that's the way the Kubjika Tantra means to present it. That she's now a self contained unit of bliss. She's fulfilled. To put it simply, she's self fulfilled. She needs nothing outside of herself, having discovered her true essential nature as pure consciousness. Similarly, Chaitanya is fulfilled in and of himself because he is, importantly, both Krishna and Radha in one. And now, somewhat more confusingly, they argue that Ramakrishna is an incarnation of Chaitanya in the mood of Nityananda. And this is where I have to introduce Nityananda. So this is where all this whole Avatara doctrine just gets richer and more mysterious. Because it used to be like it's simple. Okay, there's God. Okay, even this is not simple. This is also really mysterious. There's God, and then God becomes man or a woman or a person. Like, what the fuck is up with that? That's already really hard to understand. But now we make it even weirder. We're like, it's not just that it's like God and God's Shakti. God wants to know what it's like to, it gets weirder. And like, so the idea of Krishna incarnating in the mood of Radha is Chaitanya. And the idea of Chaitanya incarnating in the mood of Nityananda is even more rarefied. So let's explore that idea. Nityananda, arguably, is a Naga Baba. Now, he's typically depicted as wearing blue. Often they say it's because he is Balarama. So Krishna has a brother, and in the Bhagavata, Balarama is to Krishna what Lakshmana is to Rama, what Ananta is to Vishnu. So Krishna's friend is Balarama, and his Shakti is Radha, or his consort, to use the Babaji term, is Radha, you see. So, um, what does it mean for Nityananda to be Balarama? Well, he would be in blue because Balarama is typically in blue, Krishna is typically in yellow. So Krishna wears yellow, Balarama wears blue. So when you look at Chaitanya, you see that Chaitanya is typically depicted as wearing yellow, and Nityananda, his second in command, or rather his right hand man, is his head disciple, his Vivekananda, if you will, is in blue. No surprise there. He's Balarama after all. Except, this is where it gets interesting. Except, Chaitanya would almost never wear yellow. He was almost always in white. Yellow was not his color. He was a brahmachari. He would almost always exclusively wear white. That's something I heard from Swami Bhajana Ananda Saraswati. So it can't be this yellow-blue thing. It can't be so literal like that because actually there's something else to consider here. Nityananda, as we know, is a Naga Baba. He's a sadhu. He's a monk, a mendicant monk. But he probably belonged, and this again is from some research that Swami Bhajananda and Swami's Bhajananda and Ambikananda ji are conducting. So all due credit to them for this particular observation. At that time in Bengal, the Naga Babas, these naked Shaiva ascetics, were not allowed to wander about naked because that's their whole thing was they walked about naked, right? Like Sri Ramakrishna's Guru Totapuri, Nangta, Sri Ramakrishna used to call him the naked one. That's their religion actually, walking around without any clothes. Because they are one with nature, first of all, they're perfectly innocent. Second of all, they're perfectly renounced. Because they don't have any body consciousness, they also have no shame. So the feeling of shame comes from body consciousness. The feeling of cold, all of that comes from body consciousness. But importantly, if you are truly like a child, if you're truly one with nature, you're innocent. So that was their practice. And that metaphor of being just free is importantly also associated with their metaphysic because they are formless in nature. They are non-dual pure consciousness. And non-dual pure consciousness is sky-like. It's vast and formless. It is unclothed. So it's called naked awareness. Now, this idea is important to Shiva and Kali. The two of them are almost always depicted as Digambara and Digambari, meaning they are pure non-dual consciousness. That's the true meaning of the things. They're clad in the directions. So they're infinite, and therefore they wear as their garment the universe. The universe is their garment. So when you look at the Lady of Guadalupe, she has a shawl, and that shawl has the stars of the night sky. So she's Digambari, you see. So a term for the Lady of Guadalupe would be this: she's clad in a shawl that represents the night sky with all of its stars. Now, the Naga Babas would literally do this. They would literally wander about Digambara. They were sky clad, clad in only the sky. That's the idea. Then the Muslim authorities forbade it. So in Chaitanya's time, in Nityananda's time, this is the 15th century. It was during the time of Mughal rule. And the Mughals, the Muslim Empire, were already established in India. And so they banned the practice of being naked. In fact, even the British banned it, unsurprisingly. And there's a funny story about this. Trailanga Swami of Varanasi, this is a particularly contemporary story, actually. He was put in jail twice for being naked. He ate almost nothing, but he's this huge 300-pound Shiva. And he would meditate, and people would see him floating on the Ganga. Like, he's a legendary figure. And he's very special to me because when we were in Varanasi, we accidentally found his temple. And then later, when I was with Govindanath Maharaj, he kept stressing that, like, Trailanga Swami is a living presence in Varanasi. He's left his body, but he hasn't left Varanasi. And if you found his temple by chance, it's because he himself guided you there. And I really felt that to be true. I was in the temple. It was a remarkable experience. And so Trailanga Swami, you can't deny it. He is the spirit of Varanasi, and he's still there. Anyway, the British at that time put him in jail. He lived to be about 280 years old, by the way, by even British estimates. So he was one of those like really special guys. Anyway, they put him in jail for being naked twice. Both times, the cops came to find that he was no longer in his cell. Instead, he was meditating on the roof, but the cell door was locked in both cases. That's the funny thing. That's one of those miracles associated with Trailanga Swami. They kept putting him in prison, and he kept appearing on the roof. He's like respawning on the roof, and they were like, and they gave up. And so he was allowed to just wander about naked. So anyway, in the Muslim rule, you were not allowed to wander about naked as a Naga Baba. So in response to this rule, the Naga Babas adapted, as India always does. So what they decided to do then was wear blue. That was their response to the rule. They were like, okay, we'll still be naked though, because our nakedness was a symbol. And we used our nakedness as a symbol for being sky clad because we're consciousness. So the symbol is still fine if we just wear blue. So they would wear a blue loincloth, for instance, or they would wear some kind of blue shawl or something just to cover up their nakedness. So blue is the color of Balarama, but it's also the color of Shiva, specifically because Shiva is sky clad. And so it became the color, the official Sampradaya color of this sect of Naga Babas to which Nityananda belonged. So that's why Nityananda is, in many cases, covered in blue. Okay, this next thing is more important. When Chaitanya was a child, when he was young Nimai, his elder brother left at age 16. Many people say Nityananda is that elder brother who left and became a Shaiva ascetic and then came back and joined Chaitanya in this Leela. But probably not, actually. The reason I think that's not true is because in the biography, Chaitanya goes to South India to look for his older brother, which he wouldn't have done if Nityananda was actually his older brother. So I'm just going to assume that Nityananda is not his older brother. But one thing we do know about him is he was a Tantrik. This is historically already a fact. He was a Tantrik. And it is said and argued quite convincingly that he carried with him three things. One of them was an emerald lingam. And again, this I heard from Swami Bhajanananda Saraswati. An emerald lingam, a Sri Chakra, and a Shalagram, which is very interesting because the Shalagram represents Vishnu. A Sri Chakra, which he tucked in his matted locks up here, a two-dimensional Sri Chakra, he would put it in his hair. That was representing Devi, Lalita, Tripura Sundari. And the lingam, of course, represents Shiva. So the fact that he carried all these three things is very significant, actually. In a world where we think that these people are very sectarian, probably they weren't. And then, more importantly, he would often dress like a sadhu in that he wouldn't dress at all, and except for his blue loincloth. And he had jata, which is a very Shaiva ascetic thing, by the way. Like he had jata, like matted locks. And he carried a stick, ascetics typically did. And he also carried a skull bowl, except probably it was a coconut bowl. So he was the ultimate picture of tantric asceticism. And so when he came to Chaitanya, he came as a tantric and he was absorbed in the bliss of God. Now, when we say that Chaitanya incarnating in the mood of Nityananda as Ramakrishna, it makes sense because Ramakrishna is a tantric through and through and his Ishta is Kali. So the tantric element of Ramakrishna actually pairs very nicely with the tantric element in Nityananda. And both of them have some similarities also. So Chaitanya and Nityananda are like Radha and Krishna. So some people argue that or Krishna and Radha. Some people argue that he's not Balarama at all. Nityananda is Chaitanya Shakti actually. He's coextensive with Chaitanya. The two are two in one. So Sri Ramakrishna actually had this vision of the two young brothers. You call them brothers, Gaur and Nitai, merging into him. They're often called brothers because, again, like I told you, Nityananda is believed to be Chaitanya's older brother. He had this experience of the two of them merging into him. And so he identified a lot with Chaitanya. And there are leelas where he goes to like a house where they're worshipping Chaitanya, and then he sits in the chair where Chaitanya is supposed to sit. And no one sits in that chair because Chaitanya has left the body. And then Ramakrishna shows up and he's like, oh, I'll sit in the chair because he feels like he's Chaitanya. So there are many leelas that link Ramakrishna to Chaitanya, but importantly also to Nityananda. So the two in one, Krishna and Radha is in Chaitanya, and the two in one, or I should say the four in one, Krishna and Radha in Chaitanya, and Chaitanya and Nityananda together, all of them in Ramakrishna. You get this very strong dose of a tantric emphasis of bhakti devotionalism. Final point. That was supposed to be my final point, but it brings something else to mind. In the Sikh Shastakam, in the 8 verses that Chaitanya left to us, a nectar of instruction, he says, various are thy names, O Lord, and in each and every name thy power resides. This is startlingly similar to what Sri Ramakrishna would later preach, that jote moto te pot, that all the various schools of philosophy, all the religions in the world, are all paths to God. That doesn't matter which name you choose. The love that that name generates in you. That's what matters. It doesn't matter which path you walk. It's a sincerity with which you walk it that matters. So there's so many parallels between Sri Ramakrishna's bhakti and his ecstasy and his fervor and his love for the gopis, his love for Radha, and of course in Śrī Caitanya, in whom all of these things were manifest. And you know, Sri Ramakrishna, interestingly enough, would say that Vivekananda was Radha. He often referred to him as Rādhā, which is very surprising and strange because you would think Vivekananda is Shiva and Shiva is all like masculine and stuff. But for whatever reason, Ramakrishna saw Radha in Vivekananda, and he wrote in one place, um, Naren will teach both inside and outside. And then he wrote Jai Radha or something. And he actually drew a picture of Naren's head in profile. It's a very funny picture actually, with a peacock's tail. And he explained the picture. He's like, that's Naren. There's like a Easter Island looking like head there. And then there's a tail, and he's like, those are all his followers. And then he wrote prophetically, Ramakrishna wrote prophetically, Naren will teach both inside and outside. And Vivekananda said, I will do no such thing. And then Sri Ramakrishna said, your very bones will make you do it. Anyway, Vivekananda had a vision of Radha. Allegedly, Sri Ramakrishna gave him this vision. Sri Ramakrishna appeared to him and then asked him what he wanted to see. And he said he wanted to see Radha, and Sri Ramakrishna like appeared as Radha before him. So he had that vision, and so he saw Radha in Ramakrishna, and Ramakrishna also saw Radha in him. So there's a strange and important link between Swami Vivekananda and Radha Rani, and there is also a very important but very mysterious link between Ramakrishna, Chaitanya slash Nityananda, and Krishna slash Radha. But I hope some of these ideas are exciting to you. These are some of the tantric elements in the Gaudiya Vaishnava world. Nityananda, who was a tantric Naga Baba. Chaitanya, who was a mysterious incarnation of Prakasha and Vimarsha, as well as the philosophies of Krishna and Radha and some of the more, let's say, left-hand connotations of the Ras Leela and whatnot. And of course, the Karta Bhajas and other more left-handed, or at least seemingly left-handed Gaudiya Vaishnava cults attest to this gray area in the Ras Leela. But most importantly, I just want to speak philosophically and talk about how in the acintya bhedābheda system, you get diversity and non-diversity. The jivas are all separate, Maya is separate, and Hladini Shakti is separate, and there are these various realms. Vaikuntha Loka is accepted, but it's a bit lower than this Goloka. And even the Nirguna, Nirvishesha, formless Krishna is accepted, but it's a peripheral, it's called Tanubha, a peripheral manifestation of Krishna. So it's important to remember that Acintya Bheda Bheda is actually quite inclusive. It's not pluralistic like Ramakrishna, but it's not exclusivist either like Ramanuja or like Shankara. It said that all religions are true, but hierarchically. So our religion is the best, Krishna is the best, and determinate knowledge of Krishna's form is higher than any indeterminate knowledge of Krishna's formless aspect. But they were willing to accept the formless aspect. They were willing to say that there was this part of Krishna which was formless and impersonal, but it's periphery. And there is something about Krishna that's Vishnu, but even that's lower because it's too full of majesty. The best thing about God, the singular best thing about God, is that he appears from time to time as a human, and even when he's not physically there, he's always there as your eternal playmate, your Saki, your friend, and most importantly, your one and only intimate lover who is exclusively yours. Your very own Jesus, your very own Krishna, your very own Ramakrishna, your very own Kali. So it's almost like finally the final note in the teaching is to regard God as your very own, and then to make the whole of your life nothing but the project of losing yourself more and more to the ecstasy of loving that one thing that is most worth loving, love itself, ecstasy embodied, Love personified, in whom we see Sri Ramakrishna as a full manifestation. So with that said, thank you all so much. I pray on this lunar eclipse, on this full moon, we will feel, each and every one of us, that Gopi Lila, that Ras Lila, and we'll be able to savor the nectar like so many bees buzzing in the lotus of that glorious midnight blue one, Shyama Sundara, the beautiful Krishna. Krishna Krishna, Radha Radha, Gaur Nitai, Gaur Nitai. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Gaurangarpanam Astu Shri Nityanandarpanam Astu Shri Krishna Arpanam Astu Shri Radharani Arpanam Astu Shri Ramakrishna Arpanam Astu.